So, folks, we got some nerfs coming to Hearthstone early this week. Blizzard teased Mage, Paladin, and Rogue are all getting nerfed, along with some neutral cards. I think targets like Pinflinger and the Watch Posts are particularly relevant right now and seem like the most likely targets. And with all of that in mind, that means there's going to be a huge shift at the top of the Hearthstone meta. No Minion Mage, Secret Libram Paladin in particular, really powerful decks that are defining what the meta looks like. And when those start to lose power and lose ground as high tier decks, that means there's a vacuum created where other decks come in to fill in that space and become either new tier 1 decks or really high tier 2 decks. And in this video, I want to propose the decks I think stand to gain the most from that power swing. So the decks you should probably start playing early this week when the nerfs hit, and the decks that will probably find the most success, or at the very least, archetypes you should be ready to play against if you're making your own decks and archetypes. These are the ones I think you'll start to see at the top of the Hearthstone meta. So that said, let's go ahead and jump into our decks, starting off here with Rush Warrior. And I think this actually might be one of the strongest decks when things shake out, because not only was this really bad against the decks that are getting nerfed, as you can see here on the right side in this matchups table, I think it's also pretty good against the rest of the field. In other words, a lot of the decks in this video might not beat Rush Warrior particularly well. And if you haven't seen Rush Warrior, which nobody has lately because Warrior is very much near the bottom of the meta, well, this is a list, of course, utilizing a ton of Rush minions and Rush synergy cards. So not only new cards like Rokara and Samuro, but stuff that enables those Rush minions like Playmaker and Parade Leader, allowing you to build big boards and buffed boards that not only trade super well, but create tons of pressure and problems for opponents if they can't keep up with your onslaught of minions. You're taking great value trades, you're drawing a ton of cards, and you're pushing a lot of damage with your big buff stuff. In particular, I think Rush Warrior is a deck that thrives really well against other aggro matchups. Like, it can really lock down minion-based strategies by taking value trades with Rush minions over and over again. It's also got some surprising damage output thanks to cards like ETC, enabling some Rush combos, dealing a ton of damage. It's not like the old OTK ETC stuff, but you just get enough bumper car Rush minions. You're summoning a ton of Rush minions. You can still hit your opponent for 8, 10, even up to 16 probably, with some regularity with this deck as needed, matchup dependent. So all in all, just a really high tempo, reactive sort of list that tends to thrive on faster metas and faster decks, which I think particularly early in this vacuum will show up in droves. So Rush Warrior is my kind of early pick, perhaps for your best option in the next meta, depending on how all of these countless variables and popularity numbers and all these other things start to shake out. So next up here, we got Deathrattle Demon Hunter, another deck I think will be really good after the nerfs. And you can see here it was really, really bad against Watch Post Rogue, really bad against Libram Paladin, a little better against No Minion Mage, but it's still losing 3 particularly bad, high popularity matchups, which means if this deck was already tier 2, that means it was beating a lot of other stuff that was like tier 2 or tier 3 in the meta, and it was really only losing to these 3 big matchups, which means it's probably still going to beat all that other stuff and be a competitive deck against everything else and lose all these bad matchups, which might actually make Deathrattle Demon Hunter pretty darn scary. And there have been some pros like John Bray who's popularized this a lot and has played it to very high tier levels as well, top of Legend Ladder and stuff. So I'm a little bit scared of Deathrattle Demon Hunter for sure. And if you haven't seen Deathrattle Demon Hunter list, it's pretty simple. It's the new Deathrattle package, Blackthorn and Razorboar and where's that other 3-drop guy? The Razorfin Beastmaster, basically creating a faster tempo game plan, summoning a lot of minions into play with a big follow-up of Blackthorn. Kargal Battlescar also comes into play in some of these lists, although not all. And I do think the Watch Posts have a chance to get nerfed. So the Watch Post versions of Deathrattle Demon Hunter may not be as good, but there are other versions that aren't relying on Watch Posts that are a little bit more aggressive as well. So those might thrive instead of the Watch Post versions, but both could be a potential depending on whether or not Watch Posts get nerfed. As you can see here, even on the archetype chart at HS Replay, there's some debate about what's really core to Deathrattle Demon Hunter, but I'm sure we'll find a list that makes the most sense of the new meta, and it seems like it has the power output necessary to thrive. I should also note, I didn't mention this previously, these aren't deck lists on screen. These are archetypes capturing the cards that are important and significant to these decks. If you want actual deck lists, I'm going to put those in the description below, kind of my top pick for the deck lists for each of these archetypes. So use that as a resource. This is more of a visual cue for us to understand these decks. But all that said, Deathrattle Demon Hunter looks like it has a lot of potential. So next up here is Face Hunter, and Face Hunter is definitely gaining ground right now in Hearthstone because, as you can see, it had a great matchup against Dominion Mage. So it's gaining a lot of its win percentage against Dominion Mage. Basically, it goes under Dominion Mage, just overwhelms them with stuff and tries to kill them before they can really start get going with Lunacy, particularly if they don't hit Lunacy. But even if they do, often it might take them a couple turns to really realize the swing potential or value of that Lunacy. And by the time they do, Face Hunter has just killed them using, really fast, aggressive cards like Kolkar Pack Runner to summon a bunch of minions. And then, of course, over-the-top damage with quick shots and piercing shots and even buffed trampling rhinos. So super fast starts, damage output, big follow-up cards. That is Face Hunter to a T, and that's what this list does. It's definitely shaped a little differently, more spell-based than we've seen for Face Hunters in the past, as opposed to, more minion reliance. But ultimately, the game plan is more or less the same. Just hit them really hard, really fast with tons of damage. And that works against Dominion Mage, but it doesn't work very well against Libram Paladin, because Libram Paladin is basically creating more taunt walls, more problems, secrets to disrupt, and then also has that Libram of Hope follow-up late in the game to restore a ton of life, and then that shuts down Face Hunter. So struggles a ton against Libram Paladin. For every percentage it's gaining against Dominion Mage, it's losing like twice as many against Libram Paladin. And I think that means that once Libram Paladin gets nerfed and loses a little bit of strength and popularity, then Face Hunter will gain a lot, basically. So one other thing I'll add is that in unstable metas, when we don't really know exactly what's best or what's going to be the top deck, I think sometimes face decks can thrive just because everybody's trying to optimize and figure out and playing things that may not be perfect. And face decks just kind of have a game plan and they play towards it and they're doing their thing. This might thrive most often early in the post-nerf meta and start to lose ground as people understand what's good and really refine the top of the meta. Face Hunter could definitely lose ground. So maybe play this one early in particular, especially if people are still clinging to the vestiges of Dominion Mage, even though it may not be as good post-nerf. This deck seems to have the most opportunity at that stage. All right, so next up here is Control Warlock, and a hotly debated deck, of course, because of Ticketus. Everybody's got a thought about Ticketus. But currently in Hearthstone, it's about a tier 3 list, kind of high tier 3, even at Diamond through Legend, even stronger at lower ranks. But a relevant deck, nonetheless, at high ranks, even being played in Grandmasters and stuff too. And it's got bad matchups against the top of the meta, right? Bad against Dominion Mage and Secret Libram Paladin in particular. If those go away, if this is already competitive against the rest of the field, it's going to stand to be even more competitive because its worst matchups are leaving. It does get kept in check a little bit by things like Face Hunter and Deathrattle Demon Hunter. Those are bad matchups for it if you take kind of a level 2 analysis. So depending on how much ground those gain, Warlock may not really shift much here. If those become the top 2 new decks, then Control Warlock will struggle. If some of the other slightly slower decks move to the top of the meta, then Warlock, I think, has a lot of chance to succeed. And of course, if you haven't seen Control Warlock, it's Control. It's the ultimate defensive deck. It's got a ton of late game value generation with Jiraxxus and Yashiraj, resource denial with Ticketus. It's got reactivity and board clears with Militia and Twisting Nether. It's got crazy value with Tams and Rome. So yeah, I think there's a chance Control Warlock becomes way more popular, and that's going to make Ticketus even more frustrating for people. So hopefully this is maybe held in check a little bit by some of those hyper fast, more aggressive matchups that just race this one down. Now, if you're sick of Ticketus and you don't want to see Control Warlock thrive, I do want to share our sponsor for this video. It's Fatal Core. If you don't know Fatal Core, it's a really cool community-driven card game, and it has 0 purchases. 0. Yeah, that's right. Fatal Core is crowdfunded, so it's completely backed by the community, which means, of course, the community has a huge influence on how the game develops, and everybody's rewarded when goals are met, even if you don't contribute financially. And on top of that, I think Fatal Core is a really strategically rewarding game. Everything is played face up, which of course allows for a ton of strategic decision making and counterplay options. So not only are you going to have fun, but the team at Fatal Core is really looking to change the way card games are monetized. And as you know, I always say games are way too expensive, and it's nice to see a change there. So how can you help? Well, there's a link in the description to the Steam profile for Fatal Core. It's not out quite yet, but add it to your wish list. That's huge for indie developers. It goes a really, really long way to helping the game find more people and find success. And of course, if you want to join the beta, there's also a link for that in the description below. Not only will you get to play some Fatal Core, but you'll get a special bonus. If you log in by April 15th, you'll receive a rare foil Baragast card. And this dude looks really, really cool. That'll help you kick off your Fatal Core collection. So check out those links in the description and maybe change the way we monetize card games. All right, thanks Fatal Core for sponsoring this video. Now let's talk about our next deck, Leoroxx OTK Hunter. And I love this deck. We played this the Legend actually in March last month. First couple days of the release for Forged in the Barrens. And it's a really cool deck, of course. You want to draw some buffed King Crushes and Trampling Rhinos and then summon them all at once with your Leoroxx and either attack your opponent's face or hit them really hard with the Rhinos. And a really cool way to create a defined win condition. And unfortunately, this deck's not great against the most popular decks at the moment, as you can see. Particularly struggles against Secret Libram Paladin. They just have too much healing, too many big taunts in the way. It makes it hard for your Crush to connect, and all those Libram of Hope dudes are chilling in the way. And sometimes they just also race you down, like they just create too much pressure and you can't keep up while you're assembling your combo. A little bit better against Rogue and Mage, but still not a winning matchup. So with all three of those going away, does Leoroxx OTK Hunter actually find room? Because as less oppressive and less hyper efficient decks are at the top of the meta, that tends to give you just a little bit more time to find your OTKs and do your slightly less efficient sort of plays. And that depends, right? Clearly it's got room here, but again, it's the same thing as with Control Warlock a little bit. If really hyper fast decks show up to replace the top of the meta, so that Face Hunter, the Deathrattle Demon Hunter, if those become the new overlords of Hearthstone, Leoroxx OTK Hunter is not going to succeed. If we see a slightly slower meta, then I think OTK Hunter remains a pretty viable option. So I do think this deck could go from basically like mid tier 3-ish where it is right now to, you know, mid tier 2 deck. It's a real possibility here for Leoroxx OTK Hunter, depending on the meta. Alternatively, it could totally fall away and die if that aggro dominates, because they'll just be too quick for it. But a little bit of a chance here for OTK Hunter to succeed, which I am personally super duper excited about. All right, Clown Druid up next. Of course, here we got Carnival Clown, big Druid stuff happening. There are some Celestial lists as well, but HS Replay defines Clown Druid as a non-Celestial deck and has a significantly higher win rate than Celestial lists, which are like 43%, whereas Clown Druid here is like just under 50%, basically the top of a tier 3 deck at the moment, and it's pretty bad against No Minion Mage and Secret Libram Paladin. It's got a good matchup against Watchpost Rogue, but that's the least significant of the three, and I would imagine probably the least nerfed of the three as well. But here's the crazy part, the scary part is, if you look at the matchups against the other decks in this video, Clown Druid is actually really well positioned. It's okay against Face Hunter. It's not favored, but it's okay. But it's great against Deathrattle Demon Hunter. It's great against Rush Warrior. It's actually great against Control Warlock. It just has too many boards and it's too overwhelming for even Control Warlock to keep up with. So I think it actually could be one of the best decks if you consider sort of a second level of analysis where you compare it against its peers. It seems like it has a lot of room there and against the top of the meta that's falling out as well. So Clown Druid is a bit frightening. I'm worried this could become a really impressive deck that doesn't have too many bad matchups. One bad matchup it has is Token Druid, which we're going to talk about here in a second. So Token Druid could keep this in check. They just go too wide, too fast, and it can't remove everything. But beyond that, there's not that many terrible matchups for this deck. So this could be one that kind of reshapes the meta depending on how much room there is on Secret Libram Paladin. And I should note, right, like No Minion Mage and Secret Libram Paladin aren't necessarily going to just totally die. Like they might get nerfed and still be relevant kind of tier 2 decks. So they could themselves still keep this limited in its scope, but it's nerve-wracking when you look at everything else. Clown Druid could be kind of crazy good, so certainly keep an eye on this one. So up next here is Token Druid, and I think y'all know Token Druid at this point. Go wide, buff your stuff, hit your opponent with your buffed stuff. And Token Druid, as you can see, not terrible against Dominion Mage, not great against Secret Libram Paladin because they just have too many taunts and early disruption. And great against Watchpost Rogue, honestly, to have a positive win right there. And I think Token Druid right now, based on the numbers, is really one of the best decks at the moment that's not one of the nerfed classes. Maybe Face Hunter's a little bit stronger right now because it's just really farming no minion mages. But I think Token Druid's the strongest against everything else at the moment because it's not really farming either of the two most popular decks, which means it's getting a lot of its wins against everything else. And that means when those best decks that it's losing to go away, it's still going to be getting wins against everything else. And I think that means that Token Druid's another class or deck that could be near the top of the meta when everything is settled. It seems like it's losing its worst matchups, it's retaining a lot of its good matchups, and that makes Token Druid pretty darn scary. It's also a deck that's a little bit hard to counter in some ways. Even stuff with like a ton of removal and a lot of ways to answer early aggression doesn't do especially well. For instance, like Control Warlock is almost a 50-50 matchup. Most Priest matchups with a ton of AoE are about the same. So I don't know that there's a lot of great counters necessarily to Token Druid either. Its worst matchups are No Minion Mage and Secret Libram Paladin. And some like faster Shaman decks, it looks like, as well. Rush Warrior's okay against it, etc. But it seems like it's another deck that's positioned to fit really well against everything else. So these two Druid decks might be the decks that we come to know as our new overlords in Hearthstone if we're not careful. But again, depending on how things go, it's not guaranteed. I just think it's one of the stronger, most internally consistent decks that stands to gain a ton of momentum in the post-nerf meta. All right, so next up here, my final deck. It's the last deck of the video. It's AGGRO Shaman, and so you can see it's a deck that actually does really well against No Minion Mage, and comparatively anyway. I mean, obviously it's basically 50%, but compared to everybody else, it's doing pretty well. And solid against Watchpost Rogue as well, but really, really bad against Libram Paladin. Same story for these damage-based decks. Libram Paladin has a ton of healing, and sometimes that can be tough for this to keep up with, and taunts, etc. But AGGRO Shaman was specifically called out by Ixar in his AMA, or at least Shaman as a class was called out as a deck that seemed poised to be refined and become one of the best decks in the meta according to Blizzard's internal data. Now, I don't know that that's necessarily reflected in what we see here, and I don't even think I can really suggest that based on like level 2 matchups either. Like AGGRO Shaman doesn't look positioned to farm anything else that's coming up that looks good because it's bad against Rush Warrior. It's bad against Face Hunter. It's bad against Deathrattle Demon Hunter. It's even against the two Druids we just talked about. So I don't personally really see AGGRO Shaman as the next big thing, and it's currently the best Shaman archetype. So I'm not seeing it yet as far as what Dean is seeing or what the internal data suggests. But I just wanted to note it because it seems like there's people out there who think this deck is going to make moves. I'm not convinced personally, but it's got potential, certainly. If Secret Libram Paladin was the only thing holding this back and it's good enough against everything else and it can farm some slower decks that pop up, then sure, AGGRO Shaman could go under those and overwhelm. But I don't recommend this one personally, but just maybe keep an eye on it, be ready for it in case it pops up when you're playing. Because again, this video is not just about the decks you might want to play, but it's the decks that you might be playing against and need to be ready to answer and understand exactly what tools and threats these decks present in your own ladder climb. All that said, I think that wraps it up for this video. I hope you're looking forward to the new meta. I hope you're ready to fight against or perhaps play some of these new decks that you might encounter. I'm going to, again, put deck lists down in the description below, so check those out if you want to see actual lists here as opposed to kind of archetypal breakdowns that are on screen. And that said, if you have any decks of your own, thoughts on what the meta is going to look like, where the holes are going to be, what's going to fill in those holes, share all that in the comments below. But until then, be sure to check out the sponsor in the description and in the pinned comment as well. Thanks much to Fatal Core for sponsoring this video. Thanks to you for watching. And until next time, game on.